Good morning, everyone. Being from West Africa, that was a little bit weak in its response. Greetings are pretty important, so let's try it again. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Now that's a little more like it. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you in an introductory way about community development. And I must say that my degree is not in community development. I learned most of the little bit that I know about community development in trial and error. And I like to occasionally quote African proverbs. And I think it's appropriate to note that the way I learned community development is very similar to this particular proverb that says, to get lost is to find the way. And I think that in my lostness, in terms of understanding, I was able to glean some truths and things that were very useful to me. And as I was looking at and was invited to come and participate at this particular conference, I noted the fact that as we start into talking about community development, we're being given about 45 minutes to do so. And I was thinking that maybe there would be a couple of hours to actually unpack what community development is, but I believe that's what the next couple of days is all about. So part of our challenge as we begin to think about terms and concepts is actually defining what we actually mean. What does community development actually mean? And I'd like us to think about that for just a moment. But as we begin, if you would allow me to, I would like to offer a word of prayer. Father, we are mindful this morning of our lack of knowledge, our lack of perhaps skills, our lack of perhaps mindset to fully understand what this concept is all about. So as we discuss together, as we unpack some of these issues and concepts, I pray that you would inspire these moments, that you would open our minds, that you would unblock our ears, that you would sensitize and soften our hearts so that we can hear from you even this morning. So we commit this time to you. I pray that as I speak, that I would not in any way distract from you. So Father, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, let's define community development. I'm going to make this a little more participatory, just in terms of launching this. So with those who are around you, all right, 3, 4, 2 maybe, depending on the way you are, I want you to, first of all, start inside of your own mind and your own thinking. What do we mean by community development? And what one word would you give to provide meaning for community development? How do you define community development? We're going to combine these together. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. You come up with a word, and then you're going to share it together as a group. All right? So I put 3 to 5 words. That's your group together. Okay? One word. Ready? 30 seconds. Think about it. Don't share it yet. Don't share it with anybody. What one word for you defines community development? All right, 30 seconds is up. Now turn and share as a group. Everybody go around and explain their one word. And somebody needs to write those words down as a secretary for your particular group. All right. Let me hear from a couple of groups words that you came up with. Clint, you're right in the spotlight here. What words did you come up with?
All right. Together, unified progress, generating, and local resources.
All right. That group right there. Yep.
Indigenous, contribution, as in everyone contributing, codependency, and humility.
Group over there with the light blue shirt on there. Yes.
Relationships,
Okay.
working together,
Okay.
neighbors, local ownership, and helping.
All right. Up here in the front.
Together, wealth, improvement, interdependence, connection, sharing with humility.
I like that. So it sounds like everybody has engaged a little bit with this and is you're beginning to kind of get a sense of at least some refinement in terms of what we're talking about. Keep those words. We're going to come back to those at the very end. But I just wanted to share a little little story with you that not necessarily a community development story, but a story that perhaps will help us shed some light on some of the principles that we need to be paying attention to as we particularly go into another culture and as we begin to share and engage with that particular culture. I greatly appreciate Brother Dale's expose this morning. Had some amazing insights and some very deep truths that are going to be helpful as we continue in this discussion. Some of those are going to reappear in this particular talk, but maybe in a different form. So you will hear them perhaps explained in a slightly different way. But I wanted to just start with this particular story. And before I tell you the story, I need to tell you a pre-story, if you will allow me. And that is that I need to kind of set it up so that you understand. And it goes back to a time when we were living in Burkina Faso. We were living in the capital city of Ouagadougou. And by the way, you're going to be quizzed on all these words later on, so please write them down. But in Ouagadougou, we were working with a church group. And as we were there, although I was in community development, I was also highly engaged with the local church and got engaged in a number of different ways with that church. And it was an amazing time of experiencing God's hand at work. One of the privileges, one of the unique privileges that we had was working with a number of the youth that were in that particular church. And the one youth member who was there, and I say youth can be all the way up to 30. Just so we can provide a little context, this one young fellow his name, we'll just call him Isaac. And Isaac was very engaged with us because at the time he was actually going to the University of Ouagadougou, and his particular subject matter, what he was studying in and wanted to specialize in, was English. And so he also came from the tribal group that I grew up with as a child in Mali, right across the border, because this particular tribe actually spread across both borders. So we had a lot of commonalities and a lot of language opportunities, as well as the French and the English. There was also the local language that I grew up speaking. And so we had a lot of really close discussions, and he would come over and want to practice his English in our home. And as that kind of progressed, he would just show up and we would have meals together, we would talk, and we had a really good relationship with Isaac. Something happened along the way, and I'm not sure if it was with his studies or with the finances or scholarships. I'm not sure what happened, but he had to drop out of the university. So he looked for a job, and in that job, he became kind of the head manager of a gas station for a Christian businessman. Long story short, he ended up basically taking some of the funds from the gas station, was ultimately thrown in jail, had to spend some time in jail, and before that began to unfold, as it was unfolding, he came and talked to me and said, is there any way, and he had a different explanation that I don't have time to go in for today, a different explanation for what this was all about. But he said, is there any way, he said, that I could loan him $3,000 so that he could pay back the businessman who owned this? And I said, first of all, I don't have that kind of money personally sitting here. I also am absolutely not allowed to do that with any of the funds that I oversee here with the ministry that I've been given. He was very upset, and he had counted and was hoping that our friendship was going to be enough for him to be able to be granted those funds. And as a result, he was thrown in jail for a season. So that's the pre-story. So just put that aside for a moment. While we were there in Ouagadougou, we had a really unique opportunity to host teams, work teams coming out from the United States. And this is now several years later. We were hosting a team actually out of, I believe it was out of Butler, Pennsylvania. By the way, I'm really excited to be back in kind of home country for my family. My great-grandfather actually drove a mule train on the Erie Canal. My grandfather worked in the steel mills in Pittsburgh. My dad was born and raised in Johnstown. And my mom's family actually comes from right north of Pittsburgh. So this is winding around on some of the roads here and the up and down and curves. That was very familiar to me, as much as can be familiar to a missionary kid. I spent a couple of furloughs here but over in the western part of Pennsylvania. But anyways, this work team came from Butler, Pennsylvania, and they came out, and we had kind of pre-arranged everything and kind of worked with them. And one of the ways we did that was we kind of facilitated things for teams as they would arrive. We would host them on behalf of the church. We would feed them. We would provide opportunities for engagement, but ultimately the decision on how those teams were to be used and utilized locally was also done in collaboration with the church. And I sat on the elder board with the church, and we would often discuss how this would happen. But we served as kind of a bridge between the U.S. teams and those that were coming, as well as the local church, and had a really good number of really positive experiences doing that. But in this particular case, this team arrived, and when they arrived, they began to work alongside of church members, because part of what we wanted to see happen, it wasn't just them coming to do for the church or do alongside of or to the church. The idea was that the church was needed to be participating in this, and it needed to be something that they actually needed help with. In that process, Isaac was part of the local volunteer group from the church. And he began, because of his English, he was able to work directly and talk directly with some of the team members, which was great. We highly encouraged that. But at some point along the way, Isaac began to kind of unpack his need for employment. And he explained a little bit about his educational background. And it soon developed into one particular work team member latching on to Isaac, which is highly encouraged. But Isaac also began to talk about a possibility and looking for a way that this team member would be able to fund his employment through the church. And it became quite evident as it began to be unpacked that there needed to be at least some discussion with the church. But by the time we heard about it, he brought it up. The work team member brought it up at a dinner meeting, a dinner meal that we were having together. And I said to him, I said, you know, probably what we need to do is talk to the church, because what they had already arranged was that this work team member was going to basically sponsor a literacy program through the church for the community, and he was going to have Isaac hired as the teacher. I said, first of all, that's an amazing thing. Literacy is exactly where a lot of these people need help with. And to be able to have someone as qualified as Isaac would actually be great to have him tied into this. But this is the deal. The church already has a literacy ministry. The church does it with volunteers. People participate in this without any kind of financial arrangement between the church and them. So to bring Isaac on and make him a paid staff member, being paid not by the church, but through the church with your funds, makes it a little bit touchy. And I said, my desire is to see the church actually be the impetus and the motivator behind all of this. So I think it's best if we talk to the elder board and see what they would like to have done with this. Explain what's already happened. Before we could do that, the next day, the work team member went to Isaac and said, Tim Albright told me that it's not a good idea to do this, so we're not going to follow through. And I really can't do this. So remembering the history that we had, Isaac was quite upset because now I was standing, according to the work team members' words, I was now standing in the way of him getting additional employment. He raised up quite a ruckus in the church. Nobody actually went and talked to anyone. And as you know, rumors can grow all on their own. And things began to kind of stew. Isaac was able to get the church youth quite heavily engaged in this process. And they began to stir each other up. The elders were hearing about it. They had no idea what was going on. They didn't know any of the details. And it wasn't long before this kind of bubbled up to the surface. And we had to get together and kind of explain what happened. And youth members came in. They had actually started a petition against Tim Albright and his wife to have them leave Burkina Faso. But nobody had asked any questions. They had all just kind of relied on Isaac's interpretation of what had happened and that I was basically keeping him from employment. Long story short, when the youth began to hear what had actually happened, and when the youth also understood that Isaac had a different motivation for some of this, we were sitting around a table similar to where you are sitting, and the youth began to put their heads down further and further in shame. It ended up creating a church split. Isaac ended up leaving that church. And some of the momentum in the church planting that was going on, some of the excitement for which that team had actually come to participate in, some of that began to become back burner issues. And the momentum that God had already had going on in that church was temporarily stalled. I tell you that to unpack a couple of observations, community development observations, if you would allow me to. And my apologies, but I'm going to have to bunch these together. If you ever do a PowerPoint, you're not supposed to have a whole bunch of words all in one place. And I also didn't have access to a very decent computer, so animation was going to be a challenge. So I'm going to just put a whole bunch of this in here, and you're going to have to be disciplined to just go at it line by line with me, even though that's really not how it should be. But in this case, it looks like the lines actually did work. But a couple of observations in this particular story, and these are important for understanding how we engage with communities as we're going into these communities that we want to work with in the developing world. The agent, i.e. the work team member, actually ended up going to the wrong place for his information. He engaged directly with Isaac. He actually didn't have the time investment that was needed to be able to identify whether this was a true need. And so he went to the wrong place. He didn't have the time investment that was needed to fully understand. By the way, time investment that's needed when you're first going into a community, oftentimes it's about 2 years minimum, just to understand. That's a big deal. And when we're in a rush to get things moving, and we know what needs to get fixed, that's a challenge for us. So didn't have the time for investment. The need itself was not the community's. The need was the individual's need. And there's a danger sometimes because we sometimes get wrapped up in a particular individual who wants to engage, who's very engaging, who is oftentimes, even sometimes not always the most accepted person, even in their own culture. And they sometimes surface and they come, and all of a sudden they have become the spokesperson for the community, and it really is about them. And we need to be careful that we're going to the right source, not the wrong source, to determine what the needs are. The agent, the work team member's only qualification, and I say this with delicacy, his only qualification for being able to actually speak into this situation was his purse strings, his wealth. He had the ability to change the dynamics of what was already operational in that particular community. In his mind, the agent actually, because of that, then took on the role of an expert. And as you enter into a community for the very first time, Dale just highlighted very significantly the need for us to learn from the community, to make ourselves vulnerable to that community. One of the things I love to do is that I love to put myself in the debt of somebody in the community that I've developed a relationship with. One of my really good friends in Ouagadougou, one of the things we would often do, and I would physically put myself in debt, we would go out and sometimes I would say to him, I would say, you know what, I don't have the money to buy that, but could you buy that for me? And then I would hold that debt for a while. As much as it drove me crazy that I was indebted to him, it created a different kind of dynamic. A dynamic of equality. A dynamic of you actually had something that I didn't have. And it's really important that I submit myself to that. And relationally, there's something that actually ties us together in a very unique way by putting ourselves in the debt to someone else in that local community. I would pay it off. I just wanted to make that clear eventually. But internally, coming from this culture, I didn't want to be in that position, but it was something extremely healthy relationally. Have a learner's posture. The recipients in, it should be pluralized there, the recipient and the community actually ended up being the ones who paid the highest price. Church split, shame to the youth, Isaac taking off and leaving the church altogether. Momentum was destroyed, and it was really challenging because the work team members 2 weeks later got on the airplane and they left. And those of us who were still there are the ones who ended up having to deal with the fallout. The recipient and the community ended up paying the biggest and heaviest price. Here's an African proverb for you. As you're coming in, and I might use this in a couple different talks that I have, but as you're coming into a new situation, in West Africa we say strangers have big eyes, but don't see very far. You're not the experts. You're coming into a completely new situation. There's truth, valid truth that exists already in that community. You're coming in with big eyes, perhaps thinking you know what's best. The reality is, you're not seeing very far. Strangers have big eyes but don't see very far. And finally, another observation here is that the cultural protocol was completely ignored. We get tied up in end product. We want to check off our list. Say, we did this and we did that. We need to send a letter back to our supporters. We need to provide at least some kind of foundational information so that they feel like they are supporting something that's valid. So this is what we did. This is what we did. And we lose sight of the fact that most significant in many of the cultures around the world is not the end product. It's actually the process. It's how you got there. And sometimes it's not always about whether or not the end product was what you set out to get. But the relationship that is developed along the way is where the richness comes. Can I throw out a couple more? And I'm going to have to pay attention. I have a lot of stuff to say here, but I have about 30 minutes before we have a Q&A time. A couple of values and assumptions that I want to throw out here, but people who have problems are most often the most qualified to solve them, not necessarily the outside agents. Really important principle for us to kind of latch onto. Next, solutions to problems must involve the specific cultural context. They should be SMART, and you probably know what that means, but it means SMART is an acronym that stands for specific and measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. This is really, really important. What are you going after? And line it up against a grid of SMART measurements. Development workers who arrive as experts usually have very little to offer until they've spent the time and invested in the time. People who live with developmental change, the people who live with developmental changes should be the ones who ultimately determine what it is they will change. That's a term that comes up in community development because oftentimes it is about change. We'll talk a little bit about that, perhaps not completely in the way, be able to unpack it in the next few minutes, but I want to throw up a couple of images as you kind of walk into a community. Oftentimes, there are different ways of looking at solutions to the problem that the community is wanting to deal with. So this is something I stole from my brother-in-law who worked in Southeast Asia for a number of years. So this is the particular solutions that we just talked about, the outside experts, that the experts decided as they were listening to what actually was being said, and this is what we need to do. This is what the experts actually came up with as the solution. The government actually specified that should be changed a little bit and should actually be this rather than this. A committee actually thought about it and they decided that maybe there needs to be a little bit of modification. Let's design it the way that the committee actually has in terms of their ideas about this. So the committee came up with ideas about what was actually being asked for. The experts came back and they made a proposal and they said, you know what, how about we rework this? So this is what we can come up with here. And they compromised with this particular solution. And then the government specified that they said this is what really needs to be installed here. And so this is the way it's going to work. And the issue is, what did the people actually really want? What did the community, what were they looking for? And this is what they were actually asking for. This is the challenge as you go into a community. You often get caught coming up with your own, because you're bringing your own context, you're bringing your own culture, you're bringing a lot of baggage with you that you don't even know you're carrying. And you're coming in oftentimes as an expert, and there are other experts on the ground, and then these committees get together, and the reality is what the community was looking for was significantly easier and simpler and solved their issue in a much easier fashion. For your viewing pleasure, to perhaps be plastered on a wall somewhere as you begin to engage. Can I throw out a couple of principles that I want to go through very, very quickly? We talked about what is community development. I'm going to go through these very quickly as I can, and I tend to get distracted easily. But I think it's important for us to recognize that the first principle here that we need to be looking for as we walk in and move into a community is that we need to pursue that which is God honoring. And we need to expect that God is already at work in that community. Sometimes we lose sight of the fact that He is already at work, and you need to be looking for places where He is at work and join Him there. God is at work, expect Him to be at work, and pursue that which is God honoring. Oops, you know what? This is where my clicker, I had a whole bunch of this. We need to recognize that all people, everyone is an image bearer. Everybody has intrinsic value dignity, and we need to pay attention to that. We need to respect the dignity of the poor and the marginalized and treat them as agents of their own development rather than as passive recipients. We need to embrace the stewardship of the resources God has placed in the hands of the community. And our posture in walking alongside of the community is one and should be one of humility. In James, it talks about the fact that God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Be careful of our heart attitudes as we go into these communities. Another African proverb for you. A wise man never knows all, only fools know everything. Principle number 2, let's seek sustainability. What does that look like? We need to start slow, and we need to ensure that it is specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's relevant or desirable, it's time-bound. Start slow, start small. Start with the end in mind. Precedence. Hear me closely. Precedence is a sustainability killer. And if you start big, if you start in a way that the local community will never, ever be able to sustain, when you walk out the door, you can be guaranteed that everything is going to come apart. Start small. Start with the end in mind. What do you ultimately want to, or what should the community ultimately want to see in place? Minimize external inputs, because there's actually a direct correlation between high, even exclusive internal inputs and success, which means the opposite is also true. The more external inputs there are, the less likely that it will succeed. Another African proverb, you're going to probably get tired of these here, for you, is that if you wish to move mountains tomorrow, you must start by lifting stones today. It's the small stuff. It's what might seem insignificant, but that's the best starting place. And then we need to avoid dependency. This is a word, I was thinking that this might have come up as in our community development words. It would have required two words to avoid dependency, because this is really, really significant for us. But at the end, as we're working alongside of people, we need to, as we are trying to introduce or even be a catalyst for introduction of ideas, we need to be asking ourselves this particular question. Is what I'm doing, is it a hand out or a hand up? This is the Peter and John principle, and I have a whole nother devotional that I do about that, but there's something significant about what Peter and John do in the first part of Acts as they're going into the temple at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they're met with a lame man who's there, who's calling out and asking for a handout. And what they end up doing, and they do it in Jesus' name. So there's a coupling of things that are happening. But what they end up doing is giving him a hand up for life while he's being introduced to Jesus. I have a whole message on that. I call it arms or legs. And in this case, we need to make sure that what we are doing is providing legs to the local community. And then make sure that local ownership is happening. We need to make sure that we are not doing this to people, or on their behalf for people. We need to be doing this with people, walking alongside of them. And then principle number 3, we need to promote flourishing. We need to promote diverse solutions. Remember that the marginalized have very little margin. This is important. There's very little wiggle room for the marginalized. And so we need to promote not just one solution. They need to have opportunity to see different ways forward, different positive change mechanisms in place, because they, of all people, can't put all of their eggs in one basket. Promote diverse solutions. Understand that one size does not fit all. Sometimes we get fixated on just one thing. And if you do this one thing, that's going to bring you over here. And sometimes it does not. In fact, most time it does not. We need to revere and celebrate local knowledge and solutions. These will be contributors to their success. I loved what Dale was saying about some of this. There is the opportunity for us to take local knowledge, and the more local knowledge we can leverage towards solutions, the easier and the better it will be when brand new and unfamiliar things, introducing brand new unfamiliar things. I could talk to you about moringa, for instance, the moringa tree. There are communities around the world that are very familiar with it. Others who are not familiar with it. I was in the Republic of Congo, and I was talking about this tree, and people were fascinated. And where can we get the seeds, and how do we grow this? And what was amazing to me is, I was talking and speaking in somebody's yard that they were using as a church facility, and hanging over from the neighbor's house over the wall was the very tree that I was talking about. No concept that was already locally available to them. I had the same experience in Guinea. They said, we don't even know what tree you're talking about. I said, I just drove across the countryside here, and I said almost every single Fulani village that I saw, they had moringa tree growing up in those villages. Something that is locally known, something locally available. Start with and honor local resources and assets. Can I encourage you to avoid, thank you, Clint. That may not be good, but can I encourage you to avoid deficit narratives? It's easy to go into a community and talk to them about, or listen to them, or encourage them to talk about what they don't have. That is not the starting point. It's actually very, very difficult for them, and much more difficult if we're going to be a catalyst in those particular communities if we're not engaging around the assets that they already have and are already available. And then ask, if I walk away from this particular community, will the community be empowered to continue? Is ownership actually happening from day one? Will they be able to, are you able to, as it were, work yourself out of a job? Where are we with time here? Oh, it's 10:15. We have a little bit of time. Good. Principle number 4. Focus on community. Community development is about people development. It's people in the plural form. It's a social process. So we need to help communities actually focus on community priorities, not on individuals' priorities for themselves. It's a social process, it's a community process, and individuals can often get in the way of community progress. Beware of individual motivation and those that I would call diverters. There are methods to actually engage with the community, and one of those, Terry will potentially be talking about that. He has a table in the back. One of them is community health evangelism, CHE. And it's an amazing tool and a way to engage communities in a very participatory way around identifying what they should do as a community. Cultivate a friend who is, understand what I'm saying here, who is disinterested. By that I mean someone who is not going to necessarily directly benefit from, or someone who actually doesn't necessarily need what you want to help with. Someone who is disinterested. It's really important that you engage with someone and cultivate a friendship with someone like that, and someone who can actually help you interpret the culture, to actually help navigate and to help filter what needs to be navigated and filtered. I already talked about the fact that we should put ourselves in other people's debts. It's actually, we can learn about the incarnation, or the incarnational, becoming an incarnational agent, as Dale was referencing earlier. And then encourage transformation. We need to anticipate and be prepared to address obstacles to change. And there are kind of three different larger bodies of influence that kind of engage us in terms of change and our acceptance of change. And one of those is kind of the contextual, where this is actually occurring. What's there? How do people kind of engage with each other? What's the government like? Which also spills over into some of the externals. Maybe the government is influencing certain things. Perhaps there are other things that are happening. Perhaps it's a rain issue. Perhaps it's a famine issue. Perhaps it's a civil war issue in Burkina Faso. Perhaps you have heard about, and maybe you haven't heard about, the jihadists that are there, and all of I'm talking hundreds. We're probably getting up close to 1,000 attacks that have happened in Burkina Faso in the last 5 years from the jihadists. How are those external factors influencing the ability of the people to be able to change? But one of the things I'm going to be talking about is also some of the internal, the mindset issues that keep us sometimes from changing. Being aware of and anticipating and being prepared to address those obstacles. We have a tendency to sometimes resist change. Other people embrace it, but for the most part, we do resist change. And recognize that change will occur for primarily three reasons: disruption, desperation, and inspiration. And wherever possible, inspiration is what we want to utilize to see positive change takes place. Sometimes people are obliged to, and that's okay too. You need to leverage those moments as well. Understand that with radical change, there are about 10% of the people will actually engage with leading forward. 80% will sit there and watch and decide whether or not what you're saying is actually true, or whether the change actually will make a difference. They will be unengaged. And then there are the 10% distractors, those who tend to be a little bit counterproductive, and they are often the loudest people. And we just need to be aware of that. The distractors can make a lot of noise to keep the community from moving forward. Pay attention to that. Sometimes Sometimes seeing is believing, and it actually can be the only way forward. Sometimes you need to engage people who have that 10% who are willing to try it, the people who are willing to be the change agents, who have a vision that's outside of sometimes the context or the culture, and who are willing to try something new. And sometimes they have to be willing to set up kind of a model and take whatever grief that they might be getting culturally from the others. Working with those and identifying those kinds of people. Local change agents that we engage need to be reputable. They need to be courageous because they're going to face a lot of opposition, and they need to be catalysts. They will advance change much quicker and more appropriately than an outsider like ourselves, the stranger with the big eyes. And then I'm going to steal something from Terry. I didn't really ask his permission, but I'm going to promote his book. His book is over here, by the way. And when I came across this, when I was reading his book, I thought, wow, this is so true. But it's important for us to get an image in our minds. And Deborah Julu actually in her book, Holism and Development, talks about 3 different images that often exist in terms of development itself. And it's this relationship that exists between the global north and the global south. In the first image, the horse and rider, the northern rider holds the reins and decides the course of action. It's a well-intentioned and yet not appropriate way of approaching the ways that we engage with local communities. The heart means well. It's very charitable. But oftentimes, it takes us in a direction that we don't want to go. The second one is the cow and the milker, where southern farmers end up milking the northerners for everything that he or she can get. You perhaps have met individuals who want to perhaps take advantage of you or your situations or your group. This is also a charitable system. It's well intentioned, but it's undiscerning. Finally, she says that, and by the way, this oxen credit is from the Mennonite Church. I stole it off of Flickr, so I want to give credit where credit is due here. But the idea is the oxen are equally yoked, and they represent partnerships with where both partners contribute and receive and pull together towards the same goals. Relationship is actually essential. I don't know, you of all people would know what it's like and how unwise it would be to attach a horse and an oxen together. Or a donkey and a horse together, or a donkey and an oxen together. A horse can plow by itself. You need 2 oxen to walk side by side and be accustomed to each other to be able to actually fully function and plow the proper way. But relationship, the oxen relationship is essential. Their cooperation, their getting along with each other, the training to have to work together is really important. And together, they can do something that neither one of them could do alone. They get to know each other, and we get to know each other before we start giving and contributing to the engagement. I thought those were very useful and helpful reflections and visual aids for us. But I want to just throw this Chinese poem out that's very common in development circles. You've perhaps heard it before. It unpacks a little bit some of what community development could look like. And it goes like this: go to the people, live among them, learn from them, love them, start with what they know, build on what they have. But of the best leaders of the best facilitators, when their task is done, the people, the local community will remark, "We have done it ourselves." And I would add to that last phrase, "We have done it ourselves with God's help." We have a couple more minutes here. I just want to real briefly talk about different ways that we interact with communities, putting words perhaps to some of what Deborah was sharing, to the visual part. But I want to talk about moving beyond partnership. So oftentimes these are models. So oftentimes we come in and we treat. We treat the local issues. We identify the problem, we treat them, and we're coming in as an outsider with big eyes, and we're saying this is what needs to get fixed. Sometimes we'll take another step forward, and we'll move forward and say, okay, we're going to inform. What we'll do is we inform the community what we will be doing, and then we actually still do it. You end up being kind of a PR person, a salesperson for whatever you're trying to promote, that change that you would like to see happen. And you tell them what they need. Another step forward would be consulting, where we ask people what the problem is. People actually end up participating and defining what their own needs are, what their own problems are, and there's an element of give and take. We learn from each other. We try to engage with each other, but too often external resources are involved in making it happen. And then there's this thing called partnership, which we're hoping to achieve, where the power and the authority in which the program actually functions is something that is shared. There's a spirit of cooperation and collaboration that is found at this particular level of relationship engagement. But might I suggest to you one step further, the step of mobilization, where there is a qualitative change that actually takes place. Ownership is totally the community's. We use the community's resources. The community ends up giving life and direction. The invitation comes from the people themselves. They are very participatory in the ways that they engage around that. Mobilization is what we should be shooting for. Partnership, yes, but moving beyond that to help mobilize local communities, local resources with local ideas. So I started by giving you a little quiz about some of your development words. Here are a couple of my words. This is not a definition. These are some of my words. And I cheated a little bit, but God-honoring, sustainable, flourishing, community transformation. That comes from the principles that we just talked about, the 5 principles. But you may have noticed that I actually introduced a 6th principle of mobilizing. So if you would allow me to, I would insert that here. God-honoring, sustainable, flourishing, mobilize, community transformation. Community development. Very challenging, difficult to do, but worth the journey because it's about building God's kingdom in a way where communities flourish. And the French have a term for flourishing, which I think is much more beautiful than the word flourish. And that is to épanouir, to bring in to full bloom. to full blossom. Everything that God intentioned for the community, for you, for me. God-honoring, sustainable, flourishing, mobilizing community transformation. Amen? Before we have a Q&A time here, I'm going to give you 3 minutes. I want you to revisit the words that you wrote down together as a group and talk amongst yourselves based on some of what you have heard. What's another word that you might introduce into that discussion? 3 minutes, and then we're going to have a couple of questions and answers. All right? Let's go. All right. I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's been stimulating. I hope it will eventually lead to perhaps helping us think through and perhaps even shape the ways that we engage with communities. This is not something that necessarily has to happen across the ocean. This is ways that we can engage even right where we are in our own communities. So there is a microphone. Mike has a microphone.
One in the back too. So
There's
if
one.
you have the question,
All right. Are there any questions? Go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll give a microphone to you. I'm not going to promise any answers because I'm a I have big eyes as a stranger from the outside.
How do you promote God-honoring community development when you're working with an ungodly culture?
It's a very, very good question. I think some of it comes back to the fact that we need to, even before going into a particular place, and my assumption is that this is already happening or going to happen, that there will be a lot of prayer spent on preparing the soil. I think that as we pray, we also acknowledge God at work in those places. And sometimes it's only one individual who becomes a bridge to that community. Sometimes it's a larger thing that happens. One of the things that happens as well, part of God at work is sometimes just sowing the seed. Sometimes you won't ever necessarily see the results of the seed being sown. I know of missionaries who have spent their whole lives who have not seen any quote-unquote spiritual harvest. But the next generation that came along was able to actually observe something really, really significant in that community that's directly tied back to those first missionaries who didn't have the opportunity. So part of it is acknowledging and recognizing that we are all laborers in his harvest field. Recognizing that God is at work, and that as we pray and as we have supporters who pray with us, that he will again give us the eyes to see where he is at work and to go and join him in those places with those people. And sometimes it's about modeling. Sometimes it's about walking alongside without even mentioning the name of God. But there is, like Dale was referencing this morning, he was asked where he came up with that particular Bible verse. And there is opportunity through our testimony as well that will speak to certain individuals who are in tune with. And you, as you pray, as you seek the Lord, as you pursue where he is already at work, God will open your eyes and lead people. You specifically pray for that. Be specific in your prayers as well, that God would bring people to you or open a door and give you the sensitivity to know when this person or that door is being opened to a different level of engagement. That's a really high level answer to your question and probably doesn't provide a fully satisfactory answer, but that is in fact the way God works. And we just need to be in tune with that and pray that he will give us the eyes to see, the ears to hear, and a heart sensitive to what his Spirit is wanting to lead us towards. That's another question?
You talked about the 10% that are counterproductive.
Yeah.
I
I
didn't
shouldn't
know
have
if you
talked
had
about
any
them.
redemption there. Can they be useful as converts, possibly? Once they're converted, they're loudly helpful? Or do they actually sometimes also bring legitimate weaknesses to light? Just wondering what your thoughts are.
I would be hard-pressed to say that they could not be used and their loudness could not be somehow reversed and used for the glory of God. You have to look at the life of the Apostle Paul. That's an amazing example of someone who was very loud, who was very countercultural in terms of what the gospel was all about. And yet God had to do an amazing thing, a transforming thing in his life for him to actually become the person that he became, and to be able to even be the missionary and be the author and the apostle that he became. I don't know what time it is here.
We could take one more question and then we're going to take break.
I have an amazing story I would love to share about that, but we're only going to take one more question.
Do you have any suggestions for encouraging sustainable development where a certain level of dependency has already been established?
So you remember when I talked about precedents already being established and how difficult it is? Once something is at a certain level, if you start small and slowly, you can later on ramp up. But when you're at this level and the expectation is that it's going to be this or nothing, to bring it back down to here is very, very difficult. And sometimes it requires, I don't know how to put this. Sometimes it requires tough love. Sometimes it requires just putting pause button on it and spending time cultivating relationship, bringing people up to speed as to what should be expected. What's interesting is that in many countries there are a number of different ONGs that will work alongside or work in the same territory, and it tends to be the ONG with the highest paying options that tends to kind of float to the top. And then you end up having to kind of be in competition with them. And that's a huge challenge. And so sometimes you just have to back off and say, and keep explaining that that's not what you're here to do. And sometimes it's about finding a change agent who can model something different. We could sit here and unpack that one for a long time. But that's a huge, huge challenge, and I appreciate the acknowledgement of it, because some of us are already down that road, and we're at a place where how do we get back to where we really should be? Because too much of this has gone on, and not enough of this has happened, and so how do we actually move from this to this? And part of it is in the explanation and the changing of mindsets. I'm going to be talking a little bit about mindsets this afternoon in one of the breakout sessions, so that's a possibility. But mindset change is one of the more complicated things to deal with. And one of them is this dependency mindset that is very, very challenging. I'm sorry, I don't have an easy answer for that one. But
Just a comment from our work in Haiti is some communities with that there's NGOs doing unsustainable things makes that community a community that we can't actually work in. We have to work in other communities that haven't had that dependency issues, and then later on sometimes the more dependency issue communities will come along too.
and it's in that case it's actually a long process, because you have to work with the communities that don't have that dependency, and the dependency ones have to see the ultimate result of that, which takes a long time until they say, oh, there is something worthwhile and valuable here. But I think in that process, you certainly want to breathe dignity and value into those people and let them know that your relationship with them, just because you aren't going to keep handing out, doesn't need to change, that you still deeply love them and you still want to be God honoring in their lives.